In 1944, as World War II was drawing closer to being an Allied victory, William Fox published a work titled The Superpowers: The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, Their Responsibility for Peace. While people discussing geopolitics and the balance of power is nothing new, Shotwell used the term superpower to describe how the United States, Britain, and USSR had a level of geopolitical power greater than anyone else. The term stuck, but there was never an official, precise definition other than the general idea that they're really powerful nations. However, as the British Empire lost its colonies and ability to conduct imperialism on the same scale it used to before the World Wars, the Cold War established that from the 1950s onwards it was only the USSR and United States that would be superpowers, giving us the concept of a bipolar world. Then famously in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and America is currently the only superpower, although some would argue perhaps China may soon become one as well. But outside of that basic timeline of the term, people have been arguing specifics on what makes a nation a superpower as opposed to just a great power or a regional power. Is it possible to look back into history and label the empires of the past as a superpower of its time? Well, I figured I could at least try to find the most common things that people use to define a superpower, then I'll go through the major empires and nations of history and try to determine where on a power scale they are. Think of it like a tier list of sorts. The four most common factors that people have used to define a country's power status is military power, both in terms of presence and effectiveness, economic power, which is, pretty self-explanatory, cultural power, to the extent that culture is influential outside of their borders, and of course political power, the ability to influence other countries to your political goals or side. Obviously, these factors impact each other as well, and you don't need to be the exact same across all of them to necessarily have a powerful state, but they definitely make the difference. In terms of scale, there is no official geopolitical measuring power scale, but geopolitical experts and theorists have used other terms aside from superpower, and I'm going to try to make a scale from some of those terms. The first tier is going to be regional powers, nations that are more powerful than their neighbors and might even be a dominant power of their continent, but not powerful enough to have influence on a global scale. However, because of the broadness of the term region, I'll also create another tier for what I'll call multi-regional powers. Then for the third tier, we have great powers. Great powers are able to extend their influence on a near global to global scale. However, despite being able to project globally, they still might have to consider how superpowers would react to their actions. For example, could modern Germany conquer a small country on the other side of the world, like in the Americas or the Pacific? Technically, their military probably could, but they wouldn't because the importance of not upsetting the United States is a factor impossible for them to ignore, because the power difference is so drastically different. Then the superpower tier means that not only are you able to extend your influence on a global scale, but you don't even need to consider the great powers. Think about times when the United States or the Soviet Union would militarily interfere somewhere to pursue their geopolitical interests, even when the United Nations or other great powers would denounce them. Now, some use the term emerging superpower for great power nations that have the potential to become a superpower. But I want to focus on what a nation or empire has achieved, not what they could potentially have achieved. And obviously, just because a nation isn't a superpower doesn't mean that it still wasn't powerful in the literal sense. We are using modern standards on the past, so of course there will be discrepancies and technicalities here. Now, let's look through the powers of history, and I first want to handle perhaps the most interesting set of empires, those from the ancient world. One thing that made this a bit difficult was the distinguishment of great powers being able to conduct their influence near globally to globally. In the ancient world, no one even knew the entire world to begin with. But for some ancient empires, a thought crossed my mind. Should some of them count as great powers if they had conquered most of what they would consider the known world? And I ended up deciding no, because even if they conquered most of the lands that they knew about, this isn't about their own perspectives on themselves. Now, I could be a bit flexible and say global influence doesn't have to be all 7 continents. So if there was an ancient empire that reached every continent but the Americas, then sure, I could say they're a great power tier, but none of the ancient empires quite got there. Even Rome and Han China still weren't as directly influential on the other side of Eurasia as later empires would be. But they were definitely multi-regional powers for sure. Therefore, ancient Egypt, Assyria, Mauryan India, and the Sassanid Empire, those are all going under regional powers. However, Achaemenid Persia, Alexander the Great's empire, Han China, and Rome/Byzantium will go under the multi-regional power tier. For medieval times, we see a similar issue for most of the empires, so it was easy to place the Holy Roman Empire, Mali, and the Seljuk Empire under regional powers. Meanwhile, the Abbasids and Tang China are going to be placed as multi-regional powers. However, the first empire that I will put in the great power tier is the Mongol Empire. While it didn't have the status for very long, its massive size alone meant its military and economic reach was larger than anything the world had ever seen so far. I mean, they had the entire Silk Road, for goodness sake. Politically, their actions altered entire power dynamics of Europe, the Islamic world, and the parts of the Asia-Pacific regions that weren't conquered by them. I think all of that is enough to barely put them in the great power tier. For the early modern period, I'm going to place the Mughal Empire and Inca Empire on regional power tier. Ming and Qing China will go into the multi-regional power tier. One empire that I think manages to qualify for the great power status would be the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had not only a mighty economy that helped drive European colonialism in the first place, but also massive influence with its status as caliphate that allowed it to have massive influence in the Islamic community that was now more global than it was in medieval times. And the Ottomans even notably did military expeditions and raids as far as Indonesia and Iceland. While they eventually declined as the so-called sick man of Europe, I think that at their height they were definitely a great power. By this point, we're now entering the era of European colonial empires, the first empires that are truly global in every sense of the word. However, for 2 of them, I had a hard time deciding where to place them. Portugal and the Netherlands both had global colonial empires. They both militarily intervened across the world and had an impressive economy and trade network. So they are definitely both great powers, that's for sure. But are they superpowers? Some might argue that they barely qualify, but I eventually decided that they don't quite hit the mark, mainly because they don't quite compare to the nation that I would consider the first superpower, Spain. The Spanish Empire dwarfed both of them. It had a massive colonial empire across 5 continents, and for a couple centuries was a major military threat for all the other great powers. Its political ties while under the Habsburgs and its economic strength were unmatched at the time as well. Not to mention, Spain's Catholicism gave it an extra edge in shaping European geopolitics in a way that the other great powers of Europe could not ignore. So yeah, I would say, for the first empire that the sun never set on, the Spanish Empire is definitely a superpower. The next superpower I would add is France. France has had many ups and downs in its global power status, but certainly between Louis XIV's impressive military victories in Europe that debatably sealed Spain's end as a superpower in the Franco-Spanish War, its multiple successful attempts at building large empires both at home and abroad, France was a superpower. France's cultural influence to the point of French historically being considered the language of diplomacy kind of seals the deal too. France definitely lost its superpower status at some point, depending on who you ask, either as early as Napoleon's defeat in 1815 or as late as World War II. But for a while, I would say they definitely had it. Entering the late 19th century onwards, obviously the British Empire was a global superpower. I think for additional great powers, we can add the Russian Empire, Imperial and Nazi Germany, and the Japanese Empire. However, I had a bit of trouble deciding on what to do with Italy. Italy was historically referred to as one of the great powers, but they were also notably mocked for not quite hitting the mark. They had colonies, but only in North and East Africa, and, well, I guess a few acres outside of Tianjin in China, but does that really count? They had a large army and navy, but performed embarrassingly in both world wars. There's even an entire Wikipedia article on how not so great this supposedly great power was. Frankly, I feel like I need to put Italy in multi-regional power, not great power. Sorry, Italy. Obviously, both the United States and Soviet Union go into the superpower tier, and now we basically have a complete historical list. But what about contemporary? Do Russia, China, India, or perhaps the European Union qualify for superpower status? Well, the EU isn't really unified enough to really work for this tier list, so I can scratch them out. India is definitely on the rise, but I think for now they're still just a regional power. I can't think of any other region of the world other than South and maybe Southeast Asia where India has that much of an impact compared to some of the other great powers. Russia, I think, is still a great power, but as seen recently, it's not growing in power. It's trying to hold on to what leftover power it still has. That leaves China. China, once again, is definitely in the talks of having the potential to be a superpower. I think in terms of economics, it qualifies. In terms of military, it's almost there. China's military is very large, but while it is now expanding its reach, it's still not quite global yet. Its Belt and Road Initiative is also notably helping its political influence, but again, it's just not quite on the same level as the United States or even the former Soviet Union. So yeah, it is the most likely candidate to become the next superpower, but as of the making of this video, I'm more comfortable with putting China in great power status. So, like I said, there is no official global power scale. These terms are debated upon all the time. So at the end of the day, this is just my partially educational, partially amateurish opinion. If you disagree with some of my placements or you think I forgot to consider someone, by all means, leave a comment. Otherwise, I hope you liked the video. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.